皆様、大変お待たせいたしました。それでは第3部を始めさせていただきます。第3部はパネルディスカッション、アセアン及び東アジア地域の国土強靭化に向けてをお送りいたします。それでははじめにご来賓を代表いたしまして、自由民主党総務会長、国土強靭化総合調査会会長、また東アジア ASEAN 経済研究センターエリアを支援する議員連盟会長、二階俊博様よりお言葉を頂戴したいと存じます。二階会長、よろしくお願いいたします。
今朝ほども一度ご挨拶を申し上げましたが、3部で今司会者からお話のありました通り、ASEAN 東アジア経済研究センター、つまりエリアという組織を皆さんにさらにご理解をいただき、エリアを中心に ASEAN 東アジアの国土強靭化を引っ張っていってほしい。つまり地球規模でこの災害対策を進めていく上において、まずは ASEAN を中心にして、そしてこのエリアを中心にして取り組んでいくというこの姿勢を内外にご理解をいただくというのが今日お願いの趣旨であります。まずエリアを設立しまして、もう9年に設立の話が始まって9年になります。2006年、私と OECD のグレア事務総長と議論をしまして、エリア設立の構想が固まりました。最初は海のものとも山のものともわからないエリアがサミットのリーダーたちに認めていただくためには、思い切った日本の提案と心意気を示す必要があります。私は時の小泉首相と直接にこの談判をしまして、10年間に100億円の予算を投じるとともに、本拠地は普通このお金を出したところがその国に本拠地を置きたがるものでありますが、ここは小泉元総理の英断で日本に置かないで、これを ASEAN の皆さんに考えていただいて、適当と思われる場所に置いていただく。お金は日本が出す。こうして本当に日本がアジアのために、ASEAN 諸国のために貢献しようという姿勢をご理解いただくことがまず一番大事だ。これが当時の小泉総理の私に対してのお話でありました。私は最も大切なところだということを考え、前代未聞かもしれませんが、私は日本に置かない。お金は全額日本でまず出します。で、その後の運営については、この組織は素晴らしいなということを感じたそれぞれの国がいくらかずつご協力をいただければありがたい。そういう姿勢で今日まで進んでまいりました。この提案は予想外に好評でありまして、2007年11月東アジアサミットにおいてエリアの設立が合意され、2008年6月にエリアが設立されましたことはご承知の通りであります。当時の東アジアは ASEAN 10カ国、それから日中韓、さらに インド、オーストラリア、ニュージーランドを加えた16カ国。しかしその後、東アジアサミットにはアメリカとロシアが加わり、現在両国はダイアログパートナーとしてエリアとの対話を始めていただいております。エリアは東アジアのベスト&プライテストがその知恵を持ち寄ってアセアン及び東アジア統合の今後のグランドデザインを設計する機能を持っております。その最大のスポンサーであります日本は、アセアン各国と協力し、地域の人々に安心と安全を提供し、さらに公平な発展戦略を描き、環境やエネルギー問題に対応した持続的な発展を確保するために、エリアを通じてその知見を各国に提供することができると信じております。まさにそのソフトパワーを戦略的に活用して地域に貢献し、東アジア各国とウィンウィンの関係を構築することにより、我が国が東アジアにおいて21世紀を通じて重要な国であり続けるためのツールがエリアであると考えております。昨年の5月にはグレア OECD 事務総長と西村秀俊、今日もご出席をいただいておりますが、エリア事務総長が共同政策研究を実施するための了解覚書 MOU を締結をいたしました。私もそれに立ち会いましたが、感激で涙ぐんでおられる人たちもおりました。中小企業、インフラ政策、災害対策など幅広い分野において OECD とエリアが対等の立場で協力することが正式に公の場で決定され、そして関係者からご指示をいただきました。まさにエリアは東アジアのこの OECD における東アジア版だということを主張してまいりましたが、そうしたステータスが確立された瞬間でありました。ちょうど日本が OECD に参加を許されて50年になります。その50年の歴史の中で、我々は OECD と私たちが主張して各国にご協力を求めたエリアが対等の立場で今後共同研究ができるということは、我々にとっては計り知れないぐらいこの喜びとなっております。ASEAN は今年経済共同体となります。しかしながら経済統合はさらに進んでいきます。昨年の秋の ASEAN サミットで2015年以降の経済共同体の在り方についての宣言文が合意されましたが、5本ある柱のうち3番目の柱が強靭で誰もが恩恵を受けられる人間本位で人間中心の ASEAN であるわけであります。ASEAN は日本と同様非常に自然災害の多い地域であります。地震、台風、洪水、津波、火山噴火という災害から大切な命を守りたいという気持ちは万国誰もが共通であります。エリアは東アジアに共通する政策課題を見つけて、これを提言することが本筋であり、強靭化はすでに共通のテーマとなっております。設立から 7年目となったエリアでありますが、今では国際会議の場で各国首脳からその名前が聞かれるようになってまいりました。ますます活躍の場を広げ、エリアがそのパートナーとなった OECD と協力して国土強靭化シンポジウムを開いたことは非常に意義深いと考えております。また4月2日にはエリア、日本政府、さらにインドネシア政府と協力してジャカルタにおいて国土強靭化のシンポジウムが開催することになっております。今後も積極的な活動を展開して災害先進国である日本がエリアとともに OECD の協力の枠組みをいただきながら東アジアの強靭化に貢献することを切に願っております。11月5日、日本ではこの大きな津波で大変な被害を受けた日であって、以前から日本の教科書にそのことが記されております。で、これらのことをもっと世界的規模で、もっと言えば地球的規模で災害に対して全ての人々のご協力、ご理解をいただき、対策を講じていくという意味で、11月5日を世界津波の日にしてはどうかということを考え、昨日からご来場いただいております各国の首脳にご協力、ご理解を求めてまいりました。最初に申し上げたのは、インドネシアの副大統領、それから韓国、中国に至るまで、昨晩までで7カ国の有力閣僚に賛同をいただいてまいりました。これから国連の場で正式にこのことをご決定いただくために相当の努力が必要と思いますが、おそらく反対される人はほとんどいないんではないか、こう思うんです。今7カ国お願いして7カ国とも了解をいただきました。極めて、国際的なこういう場での大変気の短いご相談でありますが、しかしそれでもぼやぼやしてますと、来年再来年だと言ってると、その間に必ずどこかの国が災害にやられるわけですよ。これらに対してあらかじめ手を打っておこうということは、世界のリーダーとある人々の共通の願いであろうと信じて、私どもはその提案をしようとしているんです。ご来会の皆様のそれぞれのお立場でご理解、ご協力を賜りますよう心からお願いして、私からのお願いといたします。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。二階会長はこの後東京にて4務がございますので、ここで退席をされます。本日は誠にありがとうございました。それでは続きまして、西村秀俊東アジア ASEAN 経済研究センターエリア事務総長より主催者を代表いたしましてご挨拶を申し上げます。西村事務総長、よろしくお願いいたします。
His Excellency, Mr. Toshihiro Nikai, Chairman, General Counsel of the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, guests of honor, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of AREA, which is an organizer of this event, I would like to extend our sincere thanks to all the participants today and other persons who have extended their support and cooperation in holding this symposium. This is the second time we are holding a symposium in Sendai. Our first symposium was in 2012, just 1 year after the tragedy, on the issue of disaster resilient economy in East Asia, which was organized in cooperation with Miyagi Prefecture and Sendai City. AREA is the international organization which was the brainchild of His Excellency, Mr. Toshihiro Nikai, the then Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. In August 2006, His Excellency already mentioned. His Excellency Nikai's idea was formalized when leaders of 16 member countries agreed and established AREA at the third East Asia Summit in November 2007. Since then, AREA has been contributing through its research and other related activities to deepen economic integration in the East Asia region and improve the resiliency of this region towards disasters and economic crisis. Right after the Great East Japan earthquake in March 2011, AREA conducted a simulation analysis of the effects of the disaster in the long term, as well as what measures were to be taken in to mitigate the adverse effects. A key policy implication from this research is that enhancement of linkages between Japan and East Asia is essential for Japan's recovery from the Great East Japan earthquake, as well as for economic development in East Asia. The EAS leaders attending the 9th East Asia Summit last November noted in this statement the 3 research projects that AREA had conducted under disaster resilience in 2014, namely Policy Index for Disaster Resilience. Number 2, applying space-based technology for building resilience in ASEAN region. Number 3, mitigating supply chain risk due to natural disaster. As the auto industry is now working to build resilience in their supply chain, I hope AREA's project will promote such efforts. Also, last year AREA's research outcomes in 2013 were published by Springer, that is very famous in German publisher, world-known one, under the title Resilience and Recovery in Asian disasters. This is the book. Given the attention received from the EAS readers, AREA has taken up disaster management as one of the flagship projects. Looking at the statistics of past 10 years, disasters have happened over 150 times in this region, which is about 40% of disasters all over the world. They have affected over 2 million people and have caused economic losses which amount to $41.6 billion per year. Now, we have to understand that the disaster in a country is not just an individual country's problem. The disasters also damage the regional economy by affecting production networks in ASEAN and East Asia countries, which means we have to cooperate to develop our resilience against disasters at the regional level and as a whole. With strong support from Mr. Nikai, Japan established November 5th as the annual Tsunami Disaster Prevention Day to promote understanding and interest in tsunami countermeasures among the public. I strongly hope that this important day will be shared within ASEAN and East Asia. Based on today's discussion, to start with, we would like to further strengthen regional cooperation in this field through our future symposium on building national resilience in ASEAN countries in Indonesia, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Thank you for your attention.
ありがとうございました。それではここで再びステージの準備を少々させていただきたいと思います。皆様今しばらくお待ちください。それでは皆様、ステージ上にお願いいたします。皆様、拍手をお願いいたします。 それでは改めましてパネルディスカッション、アセアン及び東アジア地域の国土強靭化に向けてをお送りさせていただきます。ここからの進行は澤田康之東京大学教授にお願いしたいと存じます。澤田教授、皆様のご紹介も含めどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
東京大学の澤田と申します。私は災害の経済学というような分野も含めてやっておりますけれども、ここからはですね、英語でのパネルということになりますので、皆様お手元にこのサイマルテニアスの、翻訳の機会があると思いますので、そちらの方をご利用ください。Okay, thank you very much over our host. My name is Yasuyuki Sawada. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Tokyo. I have been doing research on natural and other type of man-made disasters. Today, I'm gonna act as a moderator for this panel session, session number 3, enhancing resiliency in ASEAN and East Asia. So, first of all, I'd like to give you a little background of this panel and the concept of this session. Asia, particularly the area of ASEAN member states, is the most prone region to disaster in the world. Majority of the ASEAN member states are uncovered by risk insurance, and as such, there is no substantial support from the market. At the same time, due to different profiles of disaster risks in ASEAN and East Asian economies, the development of regional disaster-linked insurance market mechanisms such as catastrophe bonds, so-called cat bond, yet to be fully developed. This session will explore rooms for deeper regional cooperation in ASEAN and East Asia. In this session, there are 3 important issues to be discussed. First, we're going to talk about how to develop and promote regional disaster risk insurance market and finance involving market mechanisms. Secondly, we're going to address how technology can be utilized for enhancing disaster response and risk management. Innovation technology we're going to touch upon will include satellite-based remote sensing data, geospatial information, and other information and communication technology. Thirdly and finally, we're going to discuss what are rooms for policy and institutional arrangement at regional and country level towards disaster risk resilience in ASEAN and East Asia. Okay. So now let me introduce today's speakers. We will welcome 3 international experts on disaster management and related issue today. From your second person from your right, Mr. Jack Radish. Jack is project manager of OECD High-Level Risk Forum, and this, OECD High-Level Risk Forum brings together government officials as well as representatives from industry to identify best practices in the management of complex risks. So, Mr. Radish will talk about disaster. Governance of critical risks, and also touch upon disaster risk assessment and financing mechanisms. And then third person from your right, Professor Ryosuke Shibasaki. Professor Shibasaki is professor and head of the Center of Spatial Information Science of University of Tokyo. He will discuss the innovation and technology of disaster management, and his talk will entitle Enhancing Disaster Management System Using Space and Geospatial Technology. And next person in the middle of our panel is Mr. Saeed Faisal. Mr. Faisal is Executive Director of ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, as known as AHA Center, AHA Center. Mr. Faisal will talk about ASEAN regional mechanism on disaster management. Okay. So now let's start our panelist presentation. I would like to welcome Mr. Radish as the first speaker. So please, Mr. Radish, please move to the podium and start your presentation. So you can take around 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for coming today to hear this panel discussion. Thank you very much for our hosts, ARIA and the government of Japan. The OECD is honored to be here. We have a distinguished panel that I'm privileged to be the first speaker of, and I'd like to draw to your attention first. I hope that you can see, one never knows with the screens. I'm going to interpret for you what is the problem facing us from economic terms. Just to interpret this data in front of us, over the last decade, we see over 1.5 trillion US dollars in economic damages from man-made and natural disasters in the OECD and BRIC countries. So this is clearly a curve on the rise. This is data taken from MDAT. And of course, OECD and many other international organizations are working to improve this data, this lost data. But as an order of magnitude, you can see the trend here is very steep, and that should be very worrying to all of our governments and our societies, and asking ourselves what we can do to reduce these damages and to finance them better. Here I bring to your attention just some maps which represent Paris, the city that I live and work in, and many of you may have visited. Here you have flood maps in Paris and the top 3 maps. We did in the OECD an economic assessment of 3 hydraulic events to understand what would be the economic impact, not just in direct damages, but as we find in OECD countries, the big damages are in the second order losses. And so when you overlay the hydraulic event to the critical networks and infrastructures, such as electricity distribution, transport, and water, the results that can have to disruption of economic activities is immense. And you see in the 3 graphs below, over a 20-quarter period, so 5 years, the deep dive in GDP, in jobs, and the rise in public debt. So this is the challenge facing our governments, their budgets, and our societies. When you think about what happens when public debt, due to a large-scale event of this sort, occurs, what does that mean for public services? And here I draw to your attention that oftentimes in the UNISDR conferences, and very rightly so, the risk drivers are brought to our attention. So oftentimes the concentration of assets, of populations, and that means a rise in exposures. But here I want to take your attention, it's hard to maybe to make out on the screen, and I'll read it for you. As a risk driver, the interconnectedness of our economies. And the reason this is interesting is because it goes to show how the impacts in one country can end up having economic impacts. So the disaster happening in one country can have economic impacts far away from the source of the original event. So this is an index of the interconnectedness of economies throughout the OECD, with the OECD average in the red bar. And you have, to the left of it, very high interconnectedness, the Global Value Chain Participation Index. You probably can't make out the names of the countries on this screen, but I draw to your attention, the second highest is Korea. So very high global value chain participation. And if you have an event in Korea, this could have, potentially depending on the industry involved, serious economic consequences far away from Korea. In the realm of disaster risk management, I think what's really changed over the last 20 years is that we're dealing now more with the unexpected. The types of events that are not just your run-of-the-mill flood or earthquake, as disastrous as those are, we're facing more and more events that we just didn't see coming and having to deal with them when they happen. that's an incredible challenge for governments and for the insurance industry as well, because how can you insure what you can't foresee and try to give some probability to, try to model, and have some sense of what the losses would be on a policy. Here, if you think about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the volcanic ash cloud over Europe, the grounded flights and stranded passengers, over 100,000 flights were canceled, huge losses to the industry, or Hurricane Sandy, which hit New York. Who would have thought that a hurricane of that magnitude would hit New York? South Florida, yes. New York, no. Huge economic damages, and I'm afraid that this is becoming more of a trend, these types of unexpected events. And that leads us to the OECD view on disaster risk management and seeing the challenge in dealing with this new risk landscape, which is characterized by the unexpected. How do you deal with that? What does it mean for governments? And to get to the root of it, we have to be more flexible, we have to be more inclusive, we have to be more transparent and open. And this is why we put the focus on the governance of risks, of critical risks, and not just managing disasters, but managing risks. So I encourage you, if you will, to take a look at the OECD recommendation, which was adopted last year at ministerial level under the presidency of Japan and Prime Minister Abe himself at the OECD. The focus here really is on a whole-of-government approach to the governance of risks. That means governments across ministries, driving coherence in policies, aligning priorities, working with the local level as well, insisting on implementation, showing leadership, working together with the private sector and the NGOs and civil society. I won't go into the detail now of the recommendation, but I do encourage you to have a look, as this governance issue is one that will certainly not go away and become very important in the toolkit of disaster risk management going forward. I'd like to say a few words now, because I was invited to do so, about the work of the OECD on disaster risk financing. The OECD in this area conducts studies. We gather information, data from countries on a voluntary basis. And this disaster risk financing in APEC economies was published in 2013. It's a wealth of information about the practices of governments in APEC on disaster risk financing. It is descriptive, it is not prescriptive. But it's important work for the OECD because disasters have such important financial impacts on government balance sheets. And in order to mitigate these impacts, governments may complement the investment in physical risk reduction with ex-ante or ex-post disaster risk finance tools. This survey of disaster risk finance in APEC countries provides descriptions of the range of ex-ante tools used in the APEC countries, such as government reserve funds or insurance policies, contingent credit arrangements, and cat bonds. Now, of course, governments could use a mix of ex-ante and ex-post DRF arrangements through such, for example, budget reallocations as an ex-post measure, debt financing, and increased taxation. But as you'll probably be familiar with the academic literature about these approaches, they're subject to much criticism as undermining longer-term development planning. And in some cases, although there's quite a bit of debate about this, about creating the conditions for moral hazard and disincentive to invest in disaster risk reduction. So I'd like to spend the time remaining just to go over a few examples in the countries that you might be more interested in. Taking from the results of this OECD survey, first, the government reserves. Dedicated disaster reserve funds are established in such economies as Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. These government reserve funds can be used for a range of natural disasters. They provide for different purposes. In Brunei Darussalam, the Ministry of Home Affairs has allocated a sum of 5 million BND each year for natural disaster-related purposes. In Indonesia, at the central government level, the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Fund is the main budget instrument to finance public post-disaster expenditures. The The central government provides funding for disaster reserve funds and state budgets, and the reserve fund is used to perform post-disaster activities. In Malaysia, a national disaster relief fund provides financial aid to disaster victims to alleviate the loss of income, damaged or demolished houses, agricultural damage, livestock, and aquaculture damage, as well as burial costs for fatalities due to disasters. So you can see that countries really are making a move to adopt some financial mechanisms to make sure that they have financial resilience and not only societal resilience. I would be remiss if I didn't mention in the Philippines, the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund provides a calamity fund for disaster relief and rehabilitation, but recently has been made more flexible so as to be used for disaster risk reduction purposes. So here in this UNISDR conference, I think it's very important to point out that new flexibility in disaster risk financing by the Philippines. Again, with the Philippines, I just give you one last example before I finish. The insurance of public assets is mainly provided by the Government Services Insurance System. It's been in place since the 1950s to indemnify or compensate the government for any damage to or loss of its properties due to fire, earthquake, storm, or other casualty. Notwithstanding this, the government, the GSSIS does provide to government assets cover, particularly those of local governments, as these were often in the past uninsured or underinsured. This issue may now be addressed given that the government reserve funds now must set aside a certain amount for the payment of insurance premiums for coverage of public assets. I'm afraid I might have gone over time already. I'll end there. I'd be happy to take questions if there is time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Radish, for nicely summarizing issues around governance of critical risks. Briefly commenting or summarizing his presentation, maybe, increasing frequency of hazards and disasters, maybe it's debatable, but it has been clear at the first part of Mr. Radish's presentation, exposure to these hazards ever increasing, and also the potential critical risks are not confined to natural disasters, but as we have seen his one of the slides, developments of global value chain also enhance complex type of disasters. So facilitating and building up a market mechanism to cope with ex-ante and ex-post is critical, but in addition, government should play a complementary role to strengthen market and also government mechanisms. So this is really important. And also towards the end of Mr. Radish's presentation, there has been some examples from ASEAN member countries. Okay, so now let's move on to the next speaker, Professor Ryosuke Shibazaki. So Professor Ryosuke Shibazaki will talk about use of enhancing disaster management system using space and geospatial technology. Okay. Please, 10-15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm Ryosuke Shibazaki. Actually, I'm a technology guy and from the Center for Spatial Information Science and the University of Tokyo. Probably my contribution to this panel discussion at first is to introduce the potential of the current technologies for the disaster risk reduction. And second is to remind you that the very successful social implementation of such kind of technologies requires a very good design of institutional scheme is a very important component for the successful application of such kind of, technologies. So, but still at the moment, the start point is the connection of Asia. Because we have, the countries in the ASEAN are connected through the round corridor. And also, probably in the very near future, we will have a relatively not very dense at all at this moment, high-speed railway networks and the connection with via sea corridor, of course, is very, very important. But at the same time, for example, we have a very huge, let's say, risk of the mega, for example, disasters. This is a picture of the Bangkok flooding. But actually, this Bangkok flooding reminds us how the Asia is really connected. Because after the flooding, actually, as someone may remember, that, the price of the hard disk soars up in Japan. Why? Because around 40% of the hard disk drive were manufactured in this specific region, the Chao Phraya River Basin. So all the factories stopped the operation or manufacturing, then the hard disk prices rises. That is a very good evidence of the connectivity of, for example, Asia. So far, the disaster risk reduction actually is taken care of by individual, let's say, governments like this, because many of the disasters are quite location-specific or local ones. However, when we look at the connectivity, such kind of impact may propagate to the other countries through the supply chain networks or something like this. And also for example, logistics, many actually trucks may go through from Vietnam to Thailand, and also, for example, in the future, Myanmar. So then, when they have a trouble in, let's say, Thailand, probably they want to have some kind of, let's say, disaster information of Thailand beforehand. And the disaster risks, as I mentioned, is now, anyway, increasing probably due to the climate change or anyway, something like this. So then, when the disaster itself becomes bigger, of course, all countries will be affected like this. So then, the key question is, of course, is how to reduce transboundary disaster risks. It has two aspects. One, disaster itself may become much bigger. The second one is the Asia is connected. So through such kind of connection links, we have a kind of indirect links. It could be sometimes serious. For example, when we want to purchase hard disk, sometimes the price was doubled. And the second one is, of course, along with connectivity links, we may move. And many companies have a kind of manufacturing, centers or factories in the different countries. So then, the transboundary activities must be, anyway, protected. And the third one is, this is my expertise. Anyway, we have a very good, nowadays, technologies. So then, we wonder, technical experts, how we could contribute to such kind of transboundary disaster risk reductions. However, that technology must be implemented. So then, institutional design is very important. So far, the disaster risk reduction is taken care of by individual national agencies. However, the recent technologies requires a relatively larger scale of infrastructure, typically space-based systems like satellites. So that must be shared. That is a kind of a new challenge for designing the, institutions for such kind of transboundary disaster reductions. And we have a kind of project funded by ERIA, and I'm a reader, and Sawada Sensei, the other technological, let's say, experts joined to this. And of course, at the beginning, we investigated how the individual countries make efforts for the disaster risk reduction. And this is in Malaysia and also the Indonesia with the collaboration of the researchers of individual countries. And also, at the same time, we have reviewed the emerging technologies. The first one is a kind of weather simulation or climate change simulations that become more, let's say, finer and more accurate, but it also requires the very huge high-performance computing system. It's a typical shared infrastructure. And also at the same time, we have a very good capability of observation. This is a GS map, global rainfall observation and measurement at with a 1 hour delay, almost real time. It covers the global. And also, the data could be transmitted through the different kinds of the satellites, for example, like this. And also on the ground, we have very dense cell phone networks. So we can easily disseminate the warning information to anyone. And also, at the same time, we could collect the data from the ground. For example, we could, let's say, monitor how the people and vehicle moves from one place to the others. So you may remember this kind of picture. Actually, these pictures are from the NHK special, Shinsai Big Data. And anyway, it demonstrates how the data from the mobile phones or cell phones could contribute to the better disaster risk responses. And also at the same time, when we look at the movement, all the terrain or crusts are also moves. So actually, we can monitor the crust movement to identify the magnitude or intensity and also the location of relatively big earthquakes. And also, even the tsunami height, of course, could be monitored far away from the coastal lines. That could be a very good warning message to the people. And also, some of the technologies is now being integrated. This is the Bangladesh case for flood warning. It started with satellite-based observation. It covers the entire Ganges or Brahmaputra river basin, and it leads to the, let's say, faster and more accurate flood estimation. And then such kind of warning message for flood is disseminated to people. At the same time, the distribution and also movement of the people is monitored by the governmental agencies. So this is a kind of technological landscape we have. Anyway, this is a very huge, a kind of infrastructure, of course, that should be shared. So then, in order to fully utilize such kind of integrated use of, the space-based or geospatial technologies, international cooperation, of course, is must, because we will face the transboundary risks, disaster risks. And also, many of those technologies are driven by private sectors, a part of their own business. So then, the involvement of private sectors is a kind of, the major component. And how to take the advantage of scale economy, because the infrastructure itself have a scale economy. For example, if you have a small computers individually, those small computers cannot do anything for like a weather forecast. But once we share a supercomputer, then we can easily, let's say, implement weather forecasts or the typhoon, damage forecast or assessment or whatever. So anyway, we have to share such kind of, let's say, centralized, the infrastructures. And when we look at the institutional scheme of the international arena, unfortunately the texts are a little bit small, but anyway, please look at this. The operational phases of the disaster response. So actually, for the disaster response, many organizations works for this based on the volunteer, because it is very natural for everyone to help some other guys when the others are in a great trouble. But such kind of voluntary efforts will not continue so long. So for the preparedness, early warnings, such kind of long-term efforts are usually taken care by the international organizations, typically UN or something like this. But I'm afraid that the involvement of private sector is not very, very sufficient. So then, the institutional schemes. So actually, we can draw such kind of concept rather easily. We share a kind of information platform, but problem is how to implement. So then, we have to imagine this is just a very rough sketch or a kind of first idea. But we expect that the development agencies or international organizations, countries may provide some kind of funding or kind of data or information. In return, they could have much more value-added information because by integrating the data, we could create value-added informations. And also, we may have a kind of new users, international users. They may want to have transboundary information services. Okay, so then this is a kind of intermediate conclusions because we actually are working on, let's say, elaborating such kind of, let's say, ideas. Okay, anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shibazaki, for exciting presentation. I really feel we are entering a new era of disaster risk reduction and building up resilience. So although we are looking at super high-tech technology, use of remote sensing geospatial information, this really has a significant potential for disaster risk reduction, but also it's interesting to see that these super high-tech stuff can be nicely transformed into a very user-friendly environment. And so this is like a really exciting new issues and new ideas. Of course, in order to materialize this new type of disaster risk management and resilience, we need a close partnership between private sector and public sector. And I see the common element with the first presentation by Mr. Radish. Governance should involve ex-ante, ex-post resilience building in context of public-private partnership, and Professor Shibazaki also emphasized the importance of PPP in building up broader physical as well as institutional infrastructure across national border. Okay, so now I would like to invite the third presenter, Mr. Faisal from AHA Center. Mr. Faisal will make a presentation about ASEAN regional mechanism on disaster management. So now he's going to talk about more concrete example of how this coordination, institutional infrastructure can be built up to cope with coming disasters. Okay. So, Mr. Ramirez.
Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you very much, Area, for hosting the event and inviting AHA Center to share our experience and input as well during the discussion. We will talk a bit about the ASEAN. ASEAN, 10 countries, about 600 million people in the region. Research by the GFDRR, UNSDR, World Bank indicate that average about 4.4 billion losses. This is the average, does not include the big disaster like the Indian Ocean tsunami, the cyclone Nargis, the recent Typhoon Haiyan, as well as the Thailand big flood, which is billions of dollars as well. So very exposed to natural disaster. We have small, medium, large, and once in a while the mega disaster come. Different countries in ASEAN have a different capacities in responding to disaster. But the advantage of the region is now a capacity of one country can be transferred to the other country within the ASEAN region. In ASEAN, we have the agreement, ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, where all the 10 countries agreed to a mechanism on how to reduce disaster risk and how to respond to disaster jointly. So this provides a platform for the 10 countries on moving forward for disaster management in reducing risk, as well as jointly respond to a disaster. Enter into force now, 10 countries already signed, ratified, and it covers various aspects of disaster management, and also mentioning the need to establish the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center, or the AHA Center, to operationalize this agreement. Because the challenge with the agreement, the challenge with the policy, if the operational setup is not there, then very difficult to have the implementation. And the ADMER, or the agreement, also have this component, the work program, because agreement is like a mother document, and then after that you will need a lot of project program to assure this being implemented. We measure the achievement to assure that the agreement is not just an agreement after the signing and then after that no implementation, program as well. These are the midterm review of the progress, some quite almost 60%, some quite very low, only 10%. But this is again the midterm review. We hope to accomplish as well by the end of this year a more portion for the accomplishment. We discussed as well the importance of the disaster risk financing. This is some of the finding of the World Bank when they conducted a survey for disaster risk financing in the ASEAN region. We can say that definitely highly exposed. The private sector insurance for disaster is not fully developed yet, and more disaster will be expected in the future. So there is a strong need to establish the private sector market for the insurance and disaster risk financing. Some of the recommendations for the ASEAN basically on moving forward on this risk financing issues. Now, I would like to talk more about the operational mechanism in the ASEAN region, which is called the AHA Center. Another agreement was signed to establish AHA Center. So we are covered by two agreements, the AHA Center. That's where the mandate, role, and function is given to AHA Center in performing its role and task and function. Basically, our main job is to coordinate the various aspects of disaster management in the ASEAN region with the 10 countries as well as with partners and as well as international organizations. When we talk about mechanism, there is a need as well to have the operational mechanism. In the other conferences, in the working session, been named a lot about the importance of standard operating procedures as well as exercising the procedures. So we have the mechanism on how a country will assist other country, how to mobilize experts, how to mobilize resources. This is to assure the efficient, effective response in the ASEAN region is there when the time is needed. So we call it SASOP, Standard Operating Procedures and the Standby Arrangement. AHA Center at this stage focus only on two areas. We are a 3-year-old organization, focus on preparedness, focus on disaster monitoring, as well as preparedness and emergency response. Disaster monitoring, this is where the technology become important, the data analysis become important, because monitoring everyday disaster hazard in the region, analyze that, compile that, send to all the 10 countries, alert the 10 countries, just in case there is a serious effort required by the ASEAN countries to assist one of the affected countries in the region. So AHA Center is in charge of this as a single information hub in the region when it comes to information management. So this is what we produce on the daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, is basically capturing all the information and making sure all the 10 countries at the same level of information. Then we have the response part. When disaster happens, then there is what we call a solidarity support. We believe in a lot of cases where the country will be able to handle by themselves. But since it's a member of region, then the gesture of solidarity support is also important being exposed in the disaster situation. So far we have responded around 11 disasters in the region, medium and large scale. And this is some of the activities that we have in the disaster response. A lot of this achievement as well, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the government of Japan, people of Japan, for helping ASEAN, the people of ASEAN, as well as the AHA Center. We have as well the emergency response team, where this consists of people from the ASEAN member state being trained and immediately can be deployed in a disaster. We said 8 hours. The moment we're getting notified, within 8 hours, then the team will be arriving in the affected country. of the ASEAN member state. And one of the things that we focus now is about creating the future leaders on disaster management, which we call the AHA Center Executive Program. Why this is important? I think SOP is important, knowledge is important, technology is important, but unless we create a leaders that able to implement and execute, particularly during the crisis, then a lot of things will not be effective. So we prepare the future leaders. They will train for 6 months at the AHA Center, exposed, also visiting Japan, and we hope 5-10 years from now, then we have the ASEAN leaders in each of the country which have a better capacity in responding and managing disaster in their hometown. That's all for the operationalization of the AHA Center. Basically, what we want to show that very important, when we create a policy, there is an execution model being implemented. There is an operational engine being established. People say that policy without execution is a hallucination. Everyone feels good about it, but actually nothing happened. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faisal, for sharing with us about experience of ASEAN and also AHA Center. So I'd like to briefly summarize the 3 presentations. Through these 3 panel presentations, I think we reaffirm the importance of 3 pillars. First, importance of developing ex-ante and ex-post effective resilience and disaster risk management mechanisms. Such mechanisms should be governed by both government service delivery schemes as well as private market institutional risk transfer mechanisms. So this is one first important pillars. And also we see in order to achieve this effective disaster risk management and also resilience, we need to proactively utilize new innovations such as geospatial information, geospatial data. And third pillar is, as we have just seen from Mr. Faisal's presentation, to operationalize these 2 pillars of disaster risk management, we need to formulate and strengthen institutional infrastructure, bundling high-tech monitoring, disaster monitoring, as well as grassroots level preparedness and response, as well as training programs to building up capacity of resilience. So these are the take-home message from this panel. Unfortunately, we already ran out of our time, so instead of having a Q&A with the floor and among ourselves, we would like to invite Mr. Larry Maramis, who is the Director of Cross-Sectoral Cooperation, ASEAN Secretariat, for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor Sawada. Let me begin by thanking the persons who had opened this session, namely His Excellency Toshihiro Nikai and Professor Hidetoshi Nishimura, for their opening remarks, and to thank the organizers for this privilege of addressing you. I think we were certainly inspired by the 3 panelists next to me, namely Mr. Jack Radish, the project manager of the OECD, who has helped to look into the matter of disaster risk assessment and especially the financing mechanism in Asia. And of course, Professor Shibayasaki, who discussed the enhancing disaster management system using space and geospatial technology. And of course, my friend and colleague, Mr. Said Faisal, who discussed the ASEAN regional mechanism on disaster management. ASEAN really is at a critical juncture in this time of the year because it marks the launching of the ASEAN community. And our community has now set a course of deepening integration of the ASEAN member states, not only in terms of the economy rather, but also between and among its peoples. It's all about integration and people connectivity. But integration is not without its own apprehensions, as it tends to magnify issues, and issues such as the frequency of disasters and the impacts of climate-related risks and potential technical hazards in the near future. These all pose risks to ASEAN integration. And as such, building resilient economies and ensuring that ASEAN's collective response to disasters is fast becoming an imperative. So building resilience, of course, is not just about institutions. It shouldn't only be about institutions. It's about being people-oriented, being people-centered, and of course engaging and benefiting the people. And so this is will always have to be kept in mind. And of course, the other aspect is institutionalizing resilience. And that's just another way of saying internalizing resilience through people and institutions. We heard from Said that the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, well, that is a testament to ASEAN's own strong history of cooperation. And AHA Center is the operational backbone of the of ADMER. And it's a legally binding instrument, one of the unique and few regional instruments that mandates each member states to cooperate collectively and to respond to disasters and integrate disaster risk reduction measures in national and regional policies. So technology and innovation, if I can just go back again to say that in 2011, ASEAN launched its first cross-sectoral initiative on disaster risk financing through the ASEAN Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance Forum. And there we looked at areas of not just disaster management, insurance, and finance, but they came together. So what's important about 2011 is that we really started a whole-of-government, whole-of-society approach in this specific issue. And that issue is still needed. So we do have the drivers of the ASEAN Committee for Disaster Management, the ASEAN Finance and Central Bank's deputies, and the ASEAN Insurance Regulators Meeting. These three bodies are coming together in developing this type of disaster risk reduction among our institutions. Technology and innovation market mechanisms are certainly tools that will enable ASEAN community to enhance resilience to disasters, and science and evidence-based climate scenarios will be the basis for risk financing schemes and risk transfers as they are required to address existing and potential threats to ASEAN integration. There really is a need to foster a shared understanding of how market mechanisms, risk insurance, agriculture insurance, microfinance, among others, can contribute to reducing risks. And there are other mechanisms, of course, such as cash transfers, longer-term strategies that promote sustainable livelihoods, building resilient businesses, local economies, so supply chains, protecting the environment. These are all part of a multifaceted approach that ASEAN will endeavor to undertake in its own risk reduction approaches. I'd like to thank Jack Radish in his presentation that underlined the importance of strong metrics and analysis in orienting our region to a disaster risk perspective and in financial resilience, and especially in leveraging the market mechanism. I was quite taken too by Professor Shibasaki's presentation, which reminds us how connectivity raises our disaster risk profile, how technology can contribute to understanding the transboundary dimension of disaster risks and in bringing out the possibilities of designing new institutions. This is the era of big data, cloud networks, crowdsourcing, the Internet of Things, super IT infrastructures that permeate every facet of our lives. It's a scale economy, as Professor Shigasaki said, and the need for improving transboundary information services. Said's presentation really also emphasized partnerships, and I think especially partnerships between ASEAN and East Asia is going to be a critical ingredient in enhancing resiliency. Both regions can learn from each other in sharing knowledge, best practices, lessons learned, and concretely areas of cooperation will focus on formulating indicators of resilience in the way that OECD has prepared. The developing approaches in harnessing market mechanisms will be also important, as well as the potential of the private sector. Finally, I would like to recognize the efforts of His Excellency Toshihiro Hironakai, Chairman of the Liberal Democratic Party, for really making the 5th of November here in Japan as Tsunami Prevention Day. And his own commitment or belief that we need to internationalize this. I think this is a laudable effort, and we hope that the idea gains momentum and is embraced by the international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Miss, for elaborating on 3 presentations and broadening scope of our discussion. So now this session is successfully ended. Thank you very much for joining to this session today. I'd like to return Master of Ceremony to the overall host. So I think our host is not coming, probably due to our spending overtime. So instead of paying overtime, we can now officially close. Thank you very much for your participation today.
皆様ありがとうございました。そして進行を務めてくださいました澤田教授、長時間にわたりありがとうございました。どうぞ皆様今一度大きな拍手でお見送りをお願いいたします。以上をもちまして国連防災世界会議総合フォーラムを終了とさせていただきます。